think the nuance of this and what we've had misunderstandings with about the past is like what GitHub Pages actually does, the parts that go into building a website.
Yep, and that's what we're looking into this session of ByteSized. Building your own website with GitHub Pages. And for that I invited two guests, Sarah Gibson, who you've just heard, and Jeremy Cohen. So let's build some web pages, shall we? Building, running, and maintaining a website is a lot more than just cobbling together a few lines of code written in the hypertext markup language, HTML, and cascading style sheets, CSS. Because in order to share your website with the world, you need quite a bit of infrastructure behind it. For one, you need a web server application running, the server that handles incoming requests to access your web pages, which of course also means you need a machine on which the server runs. And in order to make it easy for people to find your website, you probably want to convert the Internet Protocol address, the IP address of your web service, into a memorable link or URL, which in return means you'd need to register an entry in the domain name system, DNS for short. All of which, of course, is doable. But it takes time and, if you want to have a secure and reliable website, quite a bit of experience. Which is not to say that researchers and research software engineers don't create websites and services. They do. After all, the World Wide Web started its life at CERN, the European Nuclear Research Centre in Geneva, Switzerland. But not every researcher or research technical professional has the time, the skills, or even the budget to create and maintain a web service. And sometimes all you really need is to share a few web pages or documents with the public or other researchers. And this is of course where GitHub can come to the rescue. Launched in 2008, GitHub is a repository service for primarily software source code managed through the version control system known as Git. Git, which was created by Linus Torvalds a few years earlier. Yes, the same who also created the Linux operating system. But GitHub is not just a service to host your code. Right from the start in 2008, they made another service available, that of hosting web pages. And for good reasons. After all, you may want to share some documentation with your code, in particular when it's open source. The service is called, quite appropriately, GitHub Pages. And this is what we're talking about in this episode, and it is available to everybody with an account on GitHub. Hosting a website on GitHub Pages takes care of the infrastructure you need to run a web service on. No need to buy a machine or find one you can use, no need to set it up and configure a web service. And because GitHub is based on the Git version control system, it means that each time you push a change to a part of your web content to GitHub, the site gets updated accordingly. But there are a few things you need to do all the same. And in this episode, my guests Jeremy Cohen and Sarah Gibson take us through some of the things you need to take care of. The first thing to realize is that you don't actually create pages hosted on GitHub Pages with HTML and CSS, which might be a bit surprising. After all, your web browser expects HTML and CSS when it loads a web page. But GitHub does something quite different. You write a web content in a simple text file, and any formatting of the text, like headlines or bold text style, are done with what's called the Markdown language. It's the same formatting language that's used by your README file in your repository, for instance. And that makes creating web pages a lot simpler because there's no need to learn HTML and CSS. In theory, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, but Markdown language files are no good for web browsers. And so you would need a tool to transform your Markdown text files into the actual web pages that can be served. Luckily, GitHub provides such a tool by default, and it's called Jekyll. And this brings me to my first guest, Jeremy Cohen from Imperial College. Jeremy has also been running the ByteSized online course on this subject before this episode, and in the following conversation we dive a bit deeper into what Jekyll actually does and how it's used to create web pages hosted on GitHub. So here's Jeremy.
I'm Jeremy Cohen. I'm a research fellow in the Department of Computing at Imperial College London. I've got a background in computer science. I spent many years working as a researcher and as a research software engineer across a whole range of multidisciplinary research projects. And I then moved on to having a UK Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, EPSRC, Research Software Engineering Fellowship, which was a 5-year fellowship, which gave me a fantastic opportunity to do some work building the research software community, and particularly the regional research software community in London and the southeast of England, and also to engage a lot more with the wider community. And as part of that, I've done a lot of different activities around training, but also continuing to work on a range of different projects where it's been really important to disseminate the information of the work that we're doing on the projects. That's been, really, really great opportunity to use some of the tools I'm going to talk about in this interview. But also, I've now more recently been working as a project lead and as a co-lead across a set of projects that are helping to develop and grow the environment for what we, I think, increasingly call now digital research technical professionals within the UK community. And these are primarily people who work with research software, research data, and research computing infrastructure. And as part of that, we've been doing some really, really interesting activities that are helping to deliver skills into the community. And I think, again, the tooling that we're going to talk about today is one of those skills that's really, really valuable for many people in that community.
It kind of ties in with the sessions that we're doing, which is ByteSized DRTP rather than ByteSized RSE, which is what it used to be, which is, of course, the digital technical research professional. But the session we're going to talk about today specifically is about GitHub Pages. So people are probably familiar, well, I hope they are, with Git to some extent, and GitHub probably too, because that's the most popular repository service today. Not the only one, but the most popular one. But what are GitHub Pages?
Okay, so as you've noted, many people will indeed be familiar with the Git version control system and the GitHub Cloud platform that sits on top of that and provides an environment to manage your code, but also to do a whole range of other different things, managing projects and other functionality with your software. GitHub Pages is a great feature within GitHub that lets you publish a website that's based on content that you store and manage in a Git repository on GitHub. So this is an opportunity basically to put files into GitHub and have those files processed and then displayed as a publicly accessible web page. And there's many different approaches to do that, and I'll talk a little bit about some of them. But really, this is something which is, I think, a really useful feature for people who are trying to make content available easily. And again, I'll say a little bit more about why it's particularly useful for people in the research and research technical professional space very shortly. But GitHub Pages is what's classed as a static site hosting system. This means that it effectively takes static web content that you've got stored in GitHub, and it makes it available via a web server. This is really useful for many GitHub users because it enables you to make this content easily available, but it also allows you to do a whole lot more than just put some HTML pages in your GitHub repository and host them. Because what you do generally when you create a GitHub Pages site is you produce your content in a format called Markdown, which is a very straightforward, easy to use format for providing the content. And that content then gets processed into the web content, into HTML. This means you don't have to write HTML directly yourself. GitHub Pages has traditionally been used with what's called a static site generator, particularly one called Jekyll. And Jekyll is an open source tool that's written in Ruby. It allows you to build this web content in Markdown, and then Jekyll will use a range of different templates. There's a templating language, which again I can say a little bit more about shortly, that enables you to not simply just have some Markdown that gets converted into HTML, but do a lot more with that in terms of the formatting and the structure of that content. And Jekyll will process that content for you, make it available as HTML content within your GitHub repository, which is then hosted through GitHub Pages. So GitHub Pages is ultimately a way to make web content available through GitHub. I think it's really important to highlight that this is something that's available as a free feature within GitHub. So if you have a GitHub free account, you can use GitHub Pages within public GitHub repositories. But if you have access to a GitHub Cloud Enterprise service or one of the other kind of premium GitHub services, then you can also use GitHub Pages in private repositories. So you can have a repository where the content is private and not visible to people who are not added as collaborators on that repository, but you can publish public web content from that repository. One of the things I guess to note here is that many people in the research community, if you're based at a university, increasingly have access to some form of premium GitHub account through central institutional services. And that's, of course, not true for everybody, but there are many cases where that is now increasingly common. common. And so this is equally, I think, also a really, really great tool to use for publishing web content because of that link with GitHub and the fact that many people do have that access to some sort of premium GitHub account.
The one question that I now have is, so it's useful in general to have web pages. I mean, I don't think that needs to be argued because we live, after all, in an internet age. But why do you think it's particularly useful for researchers to create web content and on GitHub?
So GitHub Pages is obviously fantastic for hosting any sort of static web content, but it's particularly good for things like project web pages for a research project. And it's particularly good also if you're already using GitHub to manage your project files or your code. And given that lots of researchers, research software engineers, and other digital research technical professionals who are writing code do already have access to and already using GitHub, and as I noted before, potentially have access to a premium account, this is, I think, a great way to make use of the services that are already available to you to provide web content. I think it's also important maybe to highlight that it's often the case, as probably many of the listeners will know, researchers are often very time poor. If you're a researcher yourself, then you'll be familiar with this. And that's often because they don't have a team of people around them to provide support with these kinds of things. So they don't have a team of people who they can say, here's my content, create me a website and put it online. Or they don't have the funding to be able to hire people to do that in many cases. There are obviously exceptions, but it's quite common that researchers end up having to do a lot of this stuff themselves. And if you're trying to do that, as well as developing your research work and you're managing your data and processing your results and so on, then you want a straightforward way to link in with the existing tools that you're using to be able to do this easily. And so GitHub Pages, I think, is particularly good. It also ensures that you've got the opportunity to keep everything together in one space. So if you have a repository where you are working on your software project, then you can actually also host the web content from within that repository too. You can have a location where you have your files that represent the web content and host that out of the same repository. So I think it's a really nice way to link everything together and to ensure that people who have to do a lot of this stuff themselves have a straightforward way to do it.
So if you create GitHub Pages, I think it's linked to your account. So for instance, it's my username.github.io, and then that's the homepage of the GitHub Pages that I created.
Yes, absolutely. The URL that is by default created for a GitHub Pages site will be your GitHub username or the organization name where you create that repository, .github.io/the repository name. And that format, as I say, is the default format, but you do also have the opportunity to link that to a custom domain. So if you register your own domain name, you can link that into a GitHub Pages site and have that site then appear at the domain that you've registered. Again, it's very flexible and there's lots of opportunities to deploy this in different ways.
My question now is, okay, so I've got my account on GitHub or my organization account, and so I create a GitHub Pages for that, but I have maybe 3 or 4 different projects in there. And for each of which I want to create a web page. Where will they end up? Will they be separate URLs with separate home pages, so to speak, or will they go into username.github.io?
That depends very much on how you organize your repository. So if you're putting all of these files into one repository, then all of the files will appear at your username.github.io/repository name/some path. And the location where the pages actually appear, the path where the pages actually appear, is determined by how you set up those pages and how you configure them. So if you're working with the kind of default GitHub Pages setup that works with Jekyll, when you create a markdown file for Jekyll, which will get processed into HTML, there is something at the top of that file which is called front matter, and it's basically a block of additional markdown in the YAML markdown language, which is really a set of kind of key value pairs where you have a bunch of configuration parameters where there's a parameter key and then some value that says what the value of that parameter is. If you want to specify a particular location where your page appears, you can use the permalink parameter in the front matter to determine the path of the page. So there'll be the base path of the site that you've deployed, will, as you've noted already, be the username.github.io/repository name / and then some path that you set at the top of each page that you create. And you could, of course, if you have multiple projects, create multiple repositories. So you'd have a separate kind of base URL for each repository. So you've effectively got a separate GitHub Pages site for each project. But if you're working with stuff that's all related and you want to put it in the same repository, then you can control the URLs based on that, what's called front matter at the top of the markdown files that you create.
Getting it up on the GitHub Pages, I think that is relatively straightforward. The way that I remember this works is that you submit your changes to GitHub and then it automatically generates that. And then it's live. Am I getting this right?
So there's a couple of different things to cover there. The first of these is that any GitHub repository that you have, you can enable GitHub Pages for that repository. So the repository doesn't have to have a specific name as such. You can just simply enable pages in any repository, and I'll say in a moment a little bit about how that works.
Okay.
There is also the option where you can create a kind of top-level GitHub Pages site for an organization, for example. And in that case, there is a specific naming structure that you would use to create that repository. But just in terms of how you actually go about enabling GitHub Pages, within the repository, so if you have a repository, for example, with your code in it, and you decide you want to put a project site within that repository attached to your code, if you go into the repository settings in GitHub, there is actually a pages section within the settings. And within that pages section, you can control there how you manage your GitHub Pages site, how it's deployed, and various other details. So the most straightforward option is to deploy from a branch. So there will be the option in the GitHub Pages settings which says deploy from branch. And here you simply select the branch in your repository that you want to deploy from and the directory within that branch containing the site content. And GitHub will then configure a workflow process that will process your files. Every time you push to the repository, those files get reprocessed and then they get deployed to a live server so you can access them. Using this approach, you could, for example, if you have the kind of main content of your site in the main branch, could have set things up so that GitHub Pages uses the main branch. And maybe you want to have a project web page for this particular code that you've got. So maybe you create a folder or directory within that repository called website, and you can then tell GitHub Pages that it's going to deploy from the main branch from the folder called website. And within that website folder, you will have all of your markdown content and any kind of template content and whatever. Every time you then push to the main branch to that content, or every time there is a push to the main branch in general, it will rerun this GitHub workflow. Nowadays, you can go into the Actions tab within GitHub and see that workflow running. So every time you deploy, you will see under Actions that there is a kind of default build and deploy workflow that's been created for your GitHub Pages content. And you will see that process happening where the site is being built. So it's being converted from the markdown content that you have in your directory that you've specified to deploy from. And it will then convert that into HTML. That HTML content, assuming that the build is successful, will then get deployed to the web hosting environment, and that will then be available at the URL that will actually get listed for you in the pages section, so you can see where that's going to come from.
And as I remember, all of that takes just a couple of minutes, really. I mean, it obviously depends on the content of the website. It might take a little bit longer if it's a very complex one. But generally, it's very, it's like GitHub Actions. So it runs in the background, and then it notifies you if there's a problem or not, and if it's okay, and then it's live.
Indeed. So we're talking about here the most straightforward standard version of the deployment of a GitHub Pages site, but you can also select that you want to deploy using a GitHub action, a custom GitHub action. And this gives you a whole lot more flexibility, and it also provides you with the opportunity to use a range of other different frameworks and different tools. But it also is something which is more complex, and it requires more understanding of how the system works, how GitHub Actions works, and so on. So we probably don't, in the context of this interview, need to go into detail of that because there's a lot of documentation out there, but it's obviously important to point out that that is an option. And there are many things that you can do using the GitHub Actions deployment approach to use a range of different capabilities that perhaps aren't available to you in the standard approach. But for many people who are just doing a static project website, for example, the standard GitHub Pages deployment configuration is generally fine from my experience. But there are, of course, other tools that some people prefer to use. And increasingly, I think we're seeing people working with a range of different tools to do static site generation. And some of these will work through GitHub Actions. And that's a great opportunity to use a different tool if you prefer to, or working with, in a collaboration where people are already using something else.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was templates. Ultimately, we want to customize our websites, and there are some repetitive code in there, etc. And so tell us a little bit about templates and how that works.
If you're taking the most basic approach to a GitHub Pages site, you've got a Markdown file. For anybody who's familiar with Markdown, you'll know that there is a structure, a very simple structure using a hash symbol where you can set the level of a heading. So one hash is the kind of top level heading, 2 is the next level, and so on. Then you can write general text under your headings and so on. So if you've got a file that is a basic Markdown file with some headings at different levels and some text, then that will by default just get converted into a plain web page that has some HTML header tags of different sizes for the different levels of headings in the markdown, and some plain text on a white background. So this is fine if you want something really, really quick and you're not worried about design, but actually in reality, most people want something that looks a little bit more, perhaps more complex than that, with different layouts and so on.
Yeah.
And that's where you get into then needing some form of CSS, some style sheets, and some other kind of structure for your site. You can build that yourself from scratch using templates, but there are also a number of free templates that are available. And there are many different providers of free and open source templates for Jekyll and for other static site generation tools, which will give you some sort of predetermined design that you can then edit and build on. One that I've used in a few different projects is called Minimal Mistakes. It's a really powerful framework for building Jekyll sites, and it will work very nicely with GitHub Pages. But in terms of templates themselves, the template is basically some form of site structure, some sort of page structure that is HTML based and perhaps has some CSS style sheets linked to it. If you want to create those yourself from scratch, you can. You then set in those templates the locations where content appears that's coming from the pages that you've written. You can create a hierarchy of templates. So you can have a top level template that perhaps sets out the basic design of your page. So maybe it's got your project logo that sits at the top, and any kind of stuff that you need in the footer. Maybe you want to acknowledge your funder. You probably want to put in a privacy policy and an accessibility statement and various other best practices that will apply when deploying a site. And you can do all of that maybe in your top level template file. And then you can create other pages which will effectively inherit from that template. So within that top level template file, you'll have all the stuff that appears on all of the pages set out in the HTML and the styling set out in CSS. And you'll then have kind of placeholders where text from other lower level templates in the hierarchy will appear. What that means is that you can then create pages that have content that inherit from that top level page, and they will all have the same look and feel as the top level page, but they can also add their own styling then at the lower level. Again, this is something which is really, really powerful. There's lots of different ways to use it. In Jekyll, the template language that is used is called Liquid. It's an open source templating language. There's lots of documentation on there about how to use it. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you become familiar with it, it provides you with a whole range of different really powerful tools and tags that you can put in to process text and content in different ways to ensure that you can make a site which appears really very professional and gives you the ability to process the content in various different ways to make it appear as you want.
So what are the common pitfalls that you've seen when people use GitHub Pages, or have you seen any at all?
That's a good question. So at the most basic level, GitHub Pages is quite simple to work with, but sometimes when you work with it the very first time, you can get stuck. If you have a typo in your file, perhaps you've got a typo in your front matter or something like that, then you might find that the site just doesn't deploy because the build has failed. You can now investigate that by going into the Actions tab in GitHub, and you will see the details that have come from the running of the processing, and hopefully you've got some sort of error message in there that will show you why it failed to deploy. It's often the case, I think, that this comes down to basic things like typos, because the basic structure of a simple markdown file is quite straightforward. But beyond that, when you start to work with more advanced templates, particularly sort of large open source frameworks and for templates for site structures like Minimal Mistakes that I mentioned, it takes a little bit of getting used to, I guess, because these things tend to be quite complicated. They have their own documentation around how they are structured and how the different layouts work and so on. So generally, solving deployment problems is one issue, and those do occur sometimes, but mostly as a result of typos in the content. But then actually getting your site to look like how you want it to look is more likely to be the case of where you might encounter some issues. And
that's I remember that.
Indeed. It's. I mean, I think that really does take a few iterations sometimes. And I guess in that sense, it's a bit like writing code. You write some code. Perhaps if you're working in a language that needs to be compiled, maybe it compiles, but it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do because there's something that's not quite how you want it, and you have to go through and debug it and find out what's happened. The documentation is great for a lot of the tools that are out there. Certainly in this environment of Jekyll and GitHub Pages, it tends to be very easy to find lots of information. It may be slightly less easy to solve your problem at first, but I think it's something where once you get used to it, it becomes a really powerful tool.
And that brings me to the question, as you quite rightly say, we go through several iterations before we are happy with the website that we want to create. We may not want to deploy it straight away to GitHub. We might want to test it locally on our machine. And I think you can do that as well, but you have to install Jekyll on your machine, and then you can test it locally.
Yes, so there are two different ways to do this. So if you have some sort of GitHub Pro account or enterprise account, then it's actually possible to do a private deployment within GitHub Pages. You can, in theory, have a private repository, deploy your page, and you'll get some kind of generated URL that is private to you, and you'll have to be signed into GitHub to be able to access that. So that's one way within the GitHub environment to preview your site. But a more practical approach, if you're doing quite an advanced or a more complex site, is to work locally with things and to be able to test your changes locally before you ever actually push them to GitHub. And to do that, as you've noted, you need to install the kind of software ecosystem and the tooling that's required to do that. So you will need Ruby on your system because Jekyll is written in the Ruby programming language. And you will then need to install a bunch of what are called Ruby gems. So these are effectively Ruby packages that will enable you to run Jekyll locally and use it to process your site. There is a bunch of documentation on how to do that. There is a list of the Ruby gems that you need and the kind of different versions that are compatible with each other in order to ensure that you can deploy that locally. That doesn't always mean it's straightforward. I've seen lots of people struggle a little bit with getting that environment deployed. But once it is deployed, then you can run your site locally. So you can run Jekyll, and there is a kind of a development mode of the development server that you can run where you basically run the Jekyll development server, and it will reprocess the files every time you edit them. So if you're working in an IDE, an integrated development environment like maybe Visual Studio Code, you've got your files on the screen, you've got your directory structure on the side, you can move around the files that you're working on, and every time you save any file, Jekyll will detect that file has been saved, or the running Jekyll development server will detect that that's been done. It will then reprocess the files, and you can simply refresh in your browser, or in some cases actually the browser will automatically refresh when there's been a change, and you will be able to see the update. So that's a really good way to be able to work locally to get something that you know is working and then push that to GitHub, because the process of pushing changes to GitHub and waiting for them to be deployed does take a little bit of time. Normally within a minute or two that it will be available. But if you need to make little changes and keep checking things, that really gives you quite a long development cycle each time that you've got to wait 1 or 2 minutes to push a small change. If you can process this locally, you can literally hit save, and within a second, you've got the updated version on your page. So it's much easier to do development on a larger or more complex site if you have a local environment where you can test things.
Yeah, indeed. Not to mention the fact that you don't want to publish something you don't want to have published, but accidentally did. Anyway, so thank you very much, Jeremy. That was great. And let's go cracking with creating GitHub Pages.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Peter. I hope people have found this interesting. I definitely recommend GitHub Pages as a great tool for people working in the research and technical professional space. And I hope people find it something that's useful and interesting. And if you did attend our ByteSized DRTP session that was on GitHub Pages, then hopefully this has given you an opportunity to hear a little bit more about the tool and to maybe refresh some of the knowledge that we covered in the session as well.
Okay, so we've learned quite a few things. To start with, you create GitHub Pages from the settings menu of your account or repository. And in the settings, you need to define a branch from which GitHub can build your website. By default, the URL of the site will be your username.github.io, but if you wish, you can replace that with a customized name. You might need to have a DNS entry for that, which is usually something you need to pay for. The magic that converts your Markdown files into web browser-ready web pages is called Jekyll, which is integrated with GitHub Pages. Jekyll itself is written in the Ruby language, but you usually don't need to worry about that, except when you want to run it locally on your machine, in which case you need to have Ruby installed. Jekyll converts Markdown files into HTML pages. This is done on GitHub each time you push changes to the content of your website to GitHub. To be precise, to the branch from which the web pages will be served. This build process is done by GitHub Actions. Talking about running Jekyll locally, that's usually a good idea so you can test your website before it goes live to the public. You can also style your GitHub pages with so-called Jekyll themes, and there are plenty available online. GitHub Pages documentation lists a few of them. Things do get a little bit more complicated when you want to create your own style and want to change a theme you downloaded. And for that you could use a template language, the one used by Jekyll. In short, there's actually quite a lot to consider when you create your pages on GitHub, but if all you need is something simple and nothing fancy, this is still a quick way of coming up with a website, and downloading and installing a theme is usually straightforward. I personally had some issues with installing Jekyll on my Mac, and it took a little bit of fiddling around to get it up and running. Having said that, I thoroughly recommend having a local Jekyll instance running. It's a quick way of checking that things are working just the way you want them to. Having spent some time talking about GitHub with Jekyll, it's important to point out that this is not the only way in which you can create pages on GitHub. Sarah Gibson, my other guest in this episode, has been working, and successfully so, with quite a different tool, a tool called Hugo. We also talked about how GitHub Pages URLs are being built in more detail, so over to Sarah now. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, how are we doing?
I'm fine, thank you very much. And we speak again. I don't know, this is number 4 or 5, I can't remember now, but we've been at it for a while, haven't we?
We have, yeah. It's just fun to talk to each other.
Yeah, it really is, yeah. This time we're talking about GitHub Pages. And I believe that you've done something for the Carpentries. I didn't actually know that you were involved in the Carpentries in the first place.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not deeply involved. I did the Carpentries training. I think it was the year I got my SSI fellowship because obviously Alex Nenadic has connections to both the SSI and the Carpentries, and there's often a few free seats for fellows. So I did the training, but I've never led a Carpentries workshop myself. And I did this course on how to set up GitHub Pages and use a site builder called Hugo to make your own blog site. I think I did it as a demonstration, like a tech talk lunch thing. Someone was like, this is really good, you should turn it into a carpentry style lesson. And I was like, cool. And of course the template is open, so I just forked it into my own repository, built out the lessons. And then someone in the Carpentries was just like, yeah, you should move this into the incubator. So it lives in the incubator now.
What does that mean? Does it mean that it's about to go out, or has it already gone out? Or what does incubator mean? I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, that's okay. Incubator is a space in the Carpentries for lessons when they're still being developed. And
right, okay.
And then they kind of graduate up. I don't know if there's another level before they become core or something. But yeah, it's kind of like when you're first kicking off a lesson. However, I don't expect mine to ever graduate. I expect it to just be incubating forever. No one really contributes to it. It's just kind of there as a resource should people need it.
But you did give a lesson then on GitHub Pages.
I did, but the Carpentry style setup came afterwards. So there's actually a YouTube video, because the meeting was recorded, of me going through from scratch, setting up a repository on GitHub. And it does all of the continuous integration to build and check your website before you deploy it onto GitHub Pages. And then there's a few stuff around creating a blog post. And it goes into a little bit of Hugo as well, because that was the tool I was using to build the actual HTML that would then be served on the internet.
So I'm not quite sure that the Carpentries themselves are on GitHub Pages. I think they have sort of their own home.
I don't know. We'd have to go back. I thought they were on GitHub Pages, but they use their own workbench to do the building. Yeah, I wasn't actually quite sure how this works in terms of Carpentries where they're being hosted, but they have their own branding. So when you go to the Carpentries website, the word GitHub doesn't enter either the URL or anywhere. So you can actually build a website that looks like a professional website using GitHub Pages, basically. Yes, you can.
And it's fairly straightforward, isn't it?
Fairly straightforward, yes. There are a few decisions you have to make along the way. I think the nuance of this and what we've had misunderstandings with about the past is what GitHub Pages actually does, the parts that go into building a website. So when we're talking about researchers, software engineers wanting to build a website, we're usually talking about documentation websites to go along with their package or whatever that is hosted as a GitHub repository. And that's really cool because that means you can keep your documentation updated as your package. And you're usually writing that in Markdown because that's a nice thing to write with. But to get it to be that website, you want to transform that Markdown into HTML, which is the language of websites. And there are a load of tools to do that for you, but none of them are GitHub Pages.
Yes.
GitHub Pages is the bit that takes the HTML and serves it on the internet and gives you a domain name and allows people to visit that domain name and find the rendered versions of your HTML. So there's like a choice you make when you decide to host your website is like, how am I going to generate the website? And this carpentries lesson I wrote that we were talking about, the choice I made there was to use a tool called Hugo that transforms Markdown into HTML. If we look at the Turing way, not hosted on GitHub Pages, but as a similar workflow, we use JupyterBook and the MistMD engine to transform Markdown files into HTML. And Pandoc probably does something similar in terms of converting text files from one format to another. Honorable mention is a tool called Jekyll.
Honorable mention in what way?
I think it's quite old, but GitHub Pages does directly hook into Jekyll, so you don't have to define your own build steps. When you're configuring GitHub Pages, you can say in the UI, I'm building a Jekyll site and I want to use this theme, and it knows how to handle that in the background. Whereas with any of these other tools, you'll probably need to like give a set of instructions in continuous integration or something else that has the build command in. So like in the case of the Turing way, it'll be like JupyterBook build. In the case of my professional website, is built on Hugo. So there's like Hugo serve, I think, or something like that. And you need to pass that command in order to generate the HTML. And then GitHub Pages picks up the HTML and serves that to the internet.
I remember that because I did my own personal website, which is also in GitHub Pages, but I did it with Jekyll. It comes out of the box with GitHub Pages, kind of.
Yeah.
Because as you say, they're both integrated, or GitHub Pages is integrated with Jekyll. Yeah. But let's take Hugo as an example. How do you actually set it up?
So Hugo has a command line interface. I would start with a folder that's like Git initialized and connected to a repository on GitHub. And I would run, I think it's Hugo init, and it will generate the base files to generate a basic website like that. There are a load of Hugo themes as well. So you can download, you can attach a theme to your website. They're usually imported as a Git submodule. And then the website itself is all configured in TOML, which is another one of these markup languages, a lot like YAML, very readable. I think the benefit of doing it this way is because you then have access to the actual theme code. So if you want to like customize a theme further to do things specifically the way you want to do, that's open to you. So I wrote a lot of specific page layouts for my website that would work on top of the theme because I wanted things a specific way that didn't quite come out of the box with the theme. And using the Jekyll that is directly integrated with GitHub Pages, I don't think allows you that kind of freedom. But also not everybody wants that. Yeah, it's a pain. But also not everybody wants that freedom.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think the great thing is as well is that because when you're writing your website content, you're writing it in Markdown, you can actually make different choices about themes or even tools later and change. I've done a lot of tool changes, theme changes over the times of like maintaining my own website and such. And it can get a little bit messy, but like it is achievable. There's always the like, when do you stop?
When is enough enough?
When is enough enough? When do you just admit that, okay, we have a functional website now? Stop going down the rabbit hole.
When we talk about integrating with GitHub Pages, what we're talking about is that it does the build step. So it takes Markdown files that you write, and then through the Jekyll commands, it actually produces the HTML pages that are being served up on GitHub. So with Hugo, you basically have to do that build step extra. Is that what I'm...
Yes. So when you configure GitHub Pages, you'd get a choice to either use Jekyll or build from GitHub Actions or deploy from a branch kind of thing. So I have a GitHub Actions pipeline in my website repository that install Hugo, clone my repository, and then just run that Hugo build command against it. GitHub Pages has evolved a lot. So when I first started using GitHub Pages, there was a special branch on your repository that you had to use called gh-pages.
Yes.
And what I would do is all of my markdown and config would be set on my default branch. And what my pipeline does would build the HTML and then push the HTML files to the gh-pages branch, which would get deployed by GitHub Pages. But it has evolved a lot, and I no longer think that that's the only way you can achieve that.
All right. That's good that you mentioned that, because that's what I remember when I built my website, that you actually had to have these GH pages.
I think there's like a setting that is like deploy from a branch, and I think you can be a lot more flexible with what branch you deploy from now. It's not something I've looked into, because once it works, it works. But if you care about those kind of things, it would be good to play around with.
Hugo is another tool, apart from Jekyll, but you also mentioned Jupyter Notebook, and I think people might be familiar with Jupyter Notebook. Jupyter Book, which is different to Jupyter Notebook. But you can do that with Jupyter Book as well.
Yes, exactly. You would run your Jupyter Book build command, you would output your HTML, push it onto your GH Pages branch or whatever, and GitHub Pages would pick that up.
So how does GitHub then itself produce the website? I remember that when I built my website, there is my username, then .github.io, and that's the kind of URL that I'm getting.
Yes, so we should mention that there is a special repository. If you create a repository under your name called username.github.io, that will be like the home page of your website. Right. And then any other repository that you own, if it has GitHub Pages enabled and deployed to, it will be a subdomain to that first domain. So it'll be your username.github.io / the repository name. So that's quite nice in that you can like link all of your projects together and like create a portfolio type thing. This is just the default name that GitHub provides. In the settings of your .github.io repository, there is an option to provide a custom domain name. So you would do that the old-fashioned way of like buying a domain name, and you would give that information to GitHub Pages, and it would no longer be github.io, it would be your domain name. But also all of your other repos that have pages would be subdomains of that new domain.
And I think that's quite important to actually point out. Most people, or many people, have different projects as we go on being developers and develop stuff. We're not creating different endpoints. So we're actually having one site, and then we have subdomains within that site, depending on from where you serve the pages.
As I say, it's a special repo, the .github.io repo, that is classed as the main. It would be interesting to see if you could overwrite or override a custom domain for a repository that isn't the .github.io. It's not a thing I've tried. I'd be interested to see if it works. But the default behavior would be that they would all be linked together as subdomains of your main.
That's what I remember too. GitHub also points out that there are some limitations to what you can do with GitHub Pages. If you plan to do a full commercial website with pay activities, etc., I don't know if anybody's ever tried that, but they say you shouldn't do that. But I think more importantly, there are some limits in terms of size, and I think in also terms of bandwidth. Have you ever run up against these kind of limits?
I have not, but then I've mostly been serving pretty simple blog sites, documentation sites. Any of the other complex websites, such as the Turing Way that I've worked on, are not served on GitHub Pages. The Turing Way is served on Netlify, which is another website serving host service. I don't know if their limitations are different to GitHub Pages, but I haven't run across anything. But as I say, I also haven't tried to do anything too outlandish.
No, we're trying not to. So do you have any tips for people when they try to create their own GitHub pages?
First of all, check out my Carpentries Incubator lesson.
And check out this lesson.
Check out this lesson and let me know if it needs updating in any way. That'll be fun. Yeah. Tips. If you're going to have continuous integration set up to check for things like broken links and spelling, that could be really helpful to catch before things go live, particularly broken links. And check your internal links as well. A lot of these tools like Hugo and Jupyter Book and such like that have capabilities built in that they can check that the HTML links that they're making to other pages internally actually resolve. So that could be really helpful. GitHub Pages is a very mature tool. There's a lot of information out there on how to build your own website, and there's a lot of different approaches you can take. So I would just say, like, don't be afraid to play, to dive in, to try different approaches and to try different tools, and know that because your content is in a markdown file, you can always pull that out, destroy the repo, set up something new, put your markdown files back in, and you haven't like lost anything other than time.
Which is precious.
Which is precious, but like, so is the information you've written in your markdown files.
Indeed. Finally, you mentioned blog posts, and you can do blog posts and GitHub Pages, and I've seen people doing that. And in fact, the first podcast that I did was Vanessa Sochard from Stanford University. I don't know if you know her. And she used to run the RSE Stories podcast for a while. She did it on GitHub Pages with Jekyll. And what you need for whether it's a podcast or whether it's a blog post is an RSS feed. So how do you set up an RSS feed on a page like that?
Use Hugo because it does it automatically.
Bingo.
Bingo. Tool choice. If RSS is a requirement, use a tool that gives you it out of the box.
All right. Okay. So you don't have to fiddle around with anything.
No, it happened by default. And again, there is a huge library of templates, and some of them are like geared towards podcasts specifically and have the right look for all of that. Do your research, I think. Don't try and do hard things. Someone's already solved it for you.
I think this is one of the continuous lessons that we're trying to instill in people, that, don't reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
At least not too often. Check out Sarah's YouTube video, the link of which you'll find in the show notes. But before I finish with a couple of quiz questions, a quick note about hosting websites on repository services. Because GitHub is not the only service there is. For instance, a popular alternative is a service called GitLab, which was created in 2014. And since 2018, we also have another repository service called Codeberg. Both GitLab and Codeberg have website hosting abilities. And aside from these two, there are of course other services like, for instance, Bitbucket. I haven't tried creating websites with any of them, but I included links for GitLab and Codeberg in case you're interested. Talking about documentation, there is indeed a wealth of documentation and tutorials available for GitHub Pages, not least the GitHub Pages documentation itself. And now, to wrap things up, here are 2 quiz questions for you to mull over. So here's number 1. What's the language you use for creating templates with Jekyll? And number 2, if you run Jekyll locally on your machine, there's one file for which you need to restart the Jekyll service when you make changes to it. Which one is it? Have some fun with the quiz questions if you have time and fancy doing them. Next week is the last Tuesday of the month, and time again for a German language episode. And this time I'm really very excited to be talking to Christine Quenzel and a long-running initiative to bring sciences to a broader public in the Night of Sciences. So if you're a German language speaker or want to brush up your language skills, I hope you tune in then. Thanks for listening. Finally, this episode is part of the ByteSized program run by the Step Up project in the UK, and I thank them for the support of the show. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.